AITA for making $8 million and using my wife's own prenup against her to leave her with zero? When my fiancée asked me to sign a prenuptial agreement, I thought it was the most awkward conversation we had ever had. But I was not offended. Actually, I understood. Claire came from a wealthy family. Her grandfather had built a large commercial real estate company, and as she had explained to me several times, a significant part of that fortune would end up being her inheritance. I did not have that kind of background. I grew up in a normal family. I worked from a young age, and when I met Claire, I was trying to get a small tech startup off the ground that was not yielding many results yet. So when she told me one night that we needed to talk about something important before the wedding, I already imagined where the conversation was heading. We were sitting at the kitchen island of her condo in downtown Austin when she said it. My family wants us to sign a prenup. She said it in an almost practical tone, as if she were talking about choosing flowers for the wedding. To protect your inheritance? I asked. She nodded immediately. Yes. Then she added something else. It is nothing personal. They never say it as something personal, but it always is a little bit. Still, I did not argue. If that makes you feel calmer, it is fine. She seemed surprised that there was no fight. Really? Yes, because at that time my financial situation was quite simple. I had my startup, some modest savings, and a considerable amount of uncertainty about the future. She, on the other hand, had an inheritance that was probably worth several million. The prenup seemed logical. A few weeks later, we went to the attorney's office who had prepared the document. The man spoke for almost 20 minutes about clauses, protected assets, separation of property, and other legal terms that I honestly barely heard. My attention was elsewhere. Claire seemed very focused. She asked specific questions, making sure everything was clear. I, on the other hand, was thinking about a product launch my startup was preparing at the time, something that if it worked could change my life, but right then it was still just a possibility. The attorney finally turned the document toward me. If everything is clear, we just need your signature here. Claire looked at me. It is only to protect what I already have. I took the pen and signed without reading, not out of absolute trust, but because at that moment I simply did not care too much. If we ever got divorced, she would protect her inheritance. It seemed fair. What neither of us knew that day was that a small clause hidden in that document was going to completely change our story. Because 4 years later my startup was sold for $8 million, and when our marriage began to deteriorate shortly after, that same prenup Claire had demanded I sign ended up being exactly the reason why she received absolutely nothing. During the first few years of marriage, the prenup was something we practically forgot about. It never came up in conversations again. It never became a topic of discussion. It simply existed. Our life ran its course. I worked long hours at the startup trying to make it grow. It was not easy. There were months when I thought everything was going to fail, moments when money was barely enough, and days when I wondered if I had taken the right path. Claire, instead, had a much more stable life. Her family supported her financially. She had access to family resources, and there was always a safety net behind her. At first, that was not a problem, but over time, a difference in how we viewed things began to show. To her, my work was something uncertain, something that might or might not work out. To me, it was everything. I remember one night in particular. I was excited because we had finally managed to close an important deal with a major client. It was not huge, but it was a big step for us. I drove home and told her enthusiastically. She listened to me for a few seconds. Then she said something I did not give much importance to at the time. That is fine, but do not get your hopes up too much. The phrase stuck with me, not because of what she said exactly, but because of the tone. It was not support, it was caution or something closer to skepticism. Those kinds of comments were repeated over time. Your startup is still very small. You should not rely on it so much. You will always have to be realistic. They were never direct attacks, but they were not words that built anything either. Meanwhile, I kept working. More hours, more effort, more risk. Until finally, after almost 4 years, everything changed. A large investor became interested in the startup. The conversation started out informal, then became serious, and finally reached a point where the word buyout started appearing on the table. I did not say anything at first. I wanted to be sure. But when the deal closed, the final figure was something not even I expected. $8 million. I perfectly remember the moment I told Claire. We were in the living room of our house. I explained everything to her. The deal, the sale, the amount. For the first time since I had known her, I saw her completely surprised. 8 million. I nodded. For a few seconds she said nothing. Then she smiled. A different smile from the ones I had seen before. I knew you could achieve it. That phrase made me think. Because it was not true. She had not said it before, but at that moment I decided to brush it off. I figured she was simply happy for me. And for a while everything seemed to improve. Claire's attitude changed. She showed more interest, more support, and more closeness, but something inside me had already started noticing small details. Comments about the money, questions about accounts, interest in how the profits were structured. Nothing too obvious, but enough to make me realize that something was shifting, and over time that change ceased to be subtle, because when money entered the equation, our marriage began to deteriorate faster than I imagined. And that was when the prenup, that document I signed without reading, reappeared in the conversation, but this time not in the way Claire expected. The first moment Claire brought up the prenup again was subtler than I anticipated. It was not an argument or a direct demand. It happened during a seemingly normal conversation about money. We were in the kitchen one night talking about what to do with the profit from selling the startup. Investments, properties, possibilities. Everything sounded fine, until she asked a very specific question. Where are you going to keep the money? The way she said it caught my attention. In various investments, I replied. Nothing definite yet. She nodded slowly. All under your name. That question was not casual. Yes, I answered. It is my money. There was a brief silence. Then she smiled, but it was a different smile. Well, we will see. I said nothing at the time, but that phrase stuck in my mind. We will see. Over the following weeks, the topic began to come up more often. At first they were indirect comments. Now that we are in another stage, we should reorganize our finances. Maybe we should look into how things are distributed for the future. It is important that we are both protected. The word protected struck me as interesting because that very same word had been the reason I signed the prenup in the first place, to protect her, but now it seems she wanted to protect herself from something else. One day she finally said it directly. I think we should review the prenup. There it was. What for? I asked. Things have changed. I nodded slowly. Yes, they changed because my startup succeeded. She did not respond to that directly. That agreement was made under other circumstances. It was made because you wanted to protect your inheritance. Yes, but now she stopped. Now what? She took a deep breath. Now there is much more at stake. Right then I understood everything. It was not about protecting what she already had. It was about accessing what I had built. The agreement is still valid, I said. Claire stared at me. It is not fair. That word made me let out a little laugh. Not out of mockery, but disbelief. It was your idea. There was silence. At that time it was different. No, at that time you had more than I did. That was the truth. And we both knew it. Circumstances change, she insisted. And agreements should change too, she added. I shook my head. No, that was the first time the conversation truly became tense. Because for the first time I was not willing to yield. You cannot keep everything, she said. That phrase completely shifted the tone of the conversation because she was no longer talking about reorganizing anything. She was talking about dividing. I am not taking anything away from you, I replied. I am respecting exactly the agreement you wanted to sign. Claire said nothing for a few seconds, then she blurted out something I did not expect. Then maybe this was a mistake. I looked at her. The prenup? She shook her head. The marriage. The silence that followed was heavy because at that moment I understood something very clearly. The problem was not the money. It was that the agreement no longer suited her. And what happened next was when I finally decided to do something I should have done from the beginning, read that document I had signed without thinking. And when I did, I discovered a clause that completely changed the game. That very night, I looked for the prenup. Finding it was not easy. It was stored in a folder with other important documents I had practically not touched since the day I signed it. For years it had been just that, one more piece of paper. Until now. I sat at the dining table, opened the folder, and began to read it for the first time with real attention. Page by page, clause by clause. At first, everything was exactly what I vaguely remembered from that day in the attorney's office. Protection of inheritances, separation of prior assets, individual responsibilities. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing surprising, until I reached a section I did not remember at all. In fact, I did not remember hearing anything about it. It was an additional clause, small, almost hidden among longer paragraphs, but very specific. And the more I read it, the more sense it started to make. It was a future asset protection clause. In simple terms, it stated that any significant increase in wealth generated by one of the parties would be considered exclusively belonging to that party, as long as there was no direct and provable contribution from the other. I read it again more slowly, then a third time, because what it meant was very clear. My startup, my work, my sale, everything I had built during those 4 years was completely covered by that clause. And most importantly, I had not asked for that clause. It had been included by Claire's attorney, probably as a way to protect the future growth of her own inheritance. But now it worked in my favor. I leaned back in the chair and let out a little laugh, not out of mockery, but irony, because the very document that had been designed to protect her was the one now protecting everything I had built. At that moment, I understood something that completely changed my way of viewing the situation. I did not have to fight. I did not have to negotiate. I did not have to justify anything. The agreement was already written and was legally clear. The next day, I called my attorney, explained everything to him, and read him the clause. There were a few seconds of silence on the other end of the call. Then he said something that confirmed what I already suspected. That clause is quite solid. What does it mean exactly? That if she cannot prove she contributed directly to the growth of your startup, that money is completely yours. I stayed silent for a few seconds. And if she tries to claim something? She can try. He paused briefly, but it is not going to be easy. I hung up the phone with a very different feeling than I had had days before. For the first time since that conversation with Claire began, I had clarity. That night, when I returned home and saw her sitting in the living room, I knew the next conversation was going to be completely different. Because this time I already knew exactly where I stood and what she was going to say next. It was going to make even clearer why that marriage was beyond repair. That night, I did not wait too long. I did not want the conversation to drag on for days or weeks, as had happened with other issues in the past. Claire was in the living room when I arrived. She had her laptop open and several papers on the table. When she looked up, her expression was no longer the same as before. It was not surprise, it was determination. "We need to talk," she said. I nodded. "Yes." I sat across from her and placed the prenup on the table. I noticed how her eyes immediately darted toward the document. "I read it," I said. There was a brief silence. "Good," she replied. "Then you know we have to update it." I shook my head. "No." Her expression changed slightly. "What do you mean, no?" I opened the document and pointed to the clause I had found the night before. "This is still in effect." Claire looked at the paragraph, read it silently, then read it again. And it was at that moment her expression completely changed, because she understood exactly what it meant. "That does not apply like that," she said quickly. "It does apply. You cannot interpret it that way." "I am not interpreting it. It is written." The atmosphere in the room shifted. The tension was now completely obvious. "That clause was meant for something else," she insisted. "Maybe, but then you cannot use it like that." "I am not using it. It is already there." There was a long silence. Claire got up from the couch and started pacing around the room. It was something she did when she was frustrated. "This is not fair," she finally said. There was that word again. "Fair was your agreement," I replied. She stopped dead in her tracks. "At that time it was different." "Yes," I looked directly at her. "At that time you were the one who had more." She did not answer, but she did not deny it either. "Now that it changed," I continued. "You want to change the rules?" She crossed her arms. "Relationships do not work like that. Contracts do." That phrase made her turn completely toward me. "Are you really going to treat this like a business?" I thought for a few seconds before answering. "You did the day you brought that document." The silence that followed was heavier than any before, because this time there was no way to soften what was happening. Claire finally spoke. "So, there is nothing else to discuss?" "No." "You are not even willing to negotiate?" I shook my head. "No." She looked at me for several seconds. Then she said something I somehow already expected. "Then, this is not going to work." I did not answer immediately because deep down I already knew that. "No," I finally said, and for the first time since it all started. The conversation did not end in an argument. It ended in something much clearer, a decision, because what neither of us said out loud in that moment was that this marriage had just ended. The days after that conversation were strangely silent. There was no yelling, no long arguments. None of the drama one imagines when a marriage breaks down. It was something much colder, more calculated, more definitive. Claire stopped trying to convince me. That was the first thing I noticed. She no longer mentioned the prenup. She no longer talked about reorganizing anything. But the change in her attitude was obvious, more distant, more reserved, more strategic. And that made me realize something important. She had stopped trying to change my decision and had started thinking about how to win another way. A couple of days later, she confirmed what I already suspected. I spoke with an attorney, she said one night with almost no emotion. I nodded. Me too. We looked at each other for a few seconds. This does not have to be complicated, she added. We can do it right. That phrase sounded reasonable, but I no longer trusted that tone. It depends on what you call right, on not destroying each other in the process. I did not answer because at that point it was no longer about destroying anything. It was about bringing closure to something that clearly no longer worked. I am going to file for divorce, she finally said. Okay. There was no reaction on my part. No surprise, no anger, nothing. And I think that was what affected her the most, because Claire was used to me reacting, arguing, trying to fix things, but not this time. This time I just accepted reality. The silence between us grew heavier. Is that all? She asked. Yes. She frowned slightly. I thought you were at least going to say something else. I looked at her. What do you want me to say? She did not answer. Because there was nothing else to say. The process officially started a few days later. Attorneys, documents, dates, everything moving forward surprisingly fast. But what caught my attention the most was how Claire started to change her strategy, because although she no longer spoke directly to me about the money, her attorney did. They tried to argue that she had contributed indirectly to my success, that the marriage had created an environment that allowed the growth of my startup, that somehow there should be compensation. Nothing aggressive, nothing exaggerated, but clearly an attempt to bypass the clause I had found. When my attorney explained their strategy to me, I only asked one question. Does she have a chance? He shook his head. Not much. He paused. The agreement is quite clear. I felt something I did not expect. It was not relief, it was confirmation, because at that moment I understood that everything happening was not a fight. It was simply the result of decisions we both had made years ago. She wanted that agreement. I signed it without reading it, and now we were both living the consequences. But what happened at the next hearing was the moment when everything stopped being a legal strategy and became completely personal. The hearing did not last more than an hour, but it was enough for everything to become clear once and for all. I entered the courtroom with my attorney without expecting much. For me, it was just another formality in the process, but Claire arrived differently. I do not know if it was the way she walked, her expression, or simply the tension she carried, but you could tell that day was important to her. We sat on opposite sides. We did not even look at each other at first. It was the attorneys who started talking. Claire's attorney presented his argument calmly. He spoke of indirect contributions, of marriage as a unit, of how the economic growth of one could be interpreted as the result of the support of the other. It was a strongly built speech, almost convincing, but there was a problem. The document. When my attorney took the floor, he did not drag it out. He simply pointed out the clause, read it, explained its scope, and then did something that practically shut down everything. Both parties signed this agreement voluntarily, he said. And the clause is explicit regarding the individual ownership of assets generated without provable direct contribution. The judge asked to see the document. He reviewed it for a few minutes in silence. Those minutes felt longer than they were. I could feel the tension in the room. Finally, he looked up. The agreement is clear. That phrase was enough. But the judge continued. There is no evidence presented showing direct contribution to the growth of the business. He paused. Therefore, the assets in question remain as individual property. Silence. A heavy silence, because that was it. There was no argument, no alternative interpretation, no leeway. Claire said nothing at first, but when we walked out of the courtroom was when everything changed. Did you really do this? She said with a mix of disbelief and anger. I stopped. I looked at her. I did not do anything. She shook her head. You know exactly what you did. I signed what you wanted. That made her stay silent for a few seconds. You could have done the right thing. That phrase made me let out a little laugh. The right thing. According to whom? She did not answer right away. According to us. There is no us. That was the first time I said it out loud. And I think that was what hurt her the most. Because arguing over money is one thing. Quite another is accepting that the relationship no longer exists. Claire took a deep breath. You are keeping everything. I stared at her. No, I am keeping what I built. A silence returned, but this time it was not awkward. It was final, because at that moment we both understood there was nothing left to discuss. The divorce was only a matter of time, and what happened next was simply the closure of something that in reality had already ended much earlier. The divorce was finalized a few weeks later, with no more hearings, no more arguments, no unexpected twists, just signatures, documents, and one last meeting where everything was officially over. It was strange. After everything that had happened, I expected to feel something stronger. Anger, sadness, relief. But I did not. It was quieter, as if something that had been broken for a long time finally stopped holding itself together. Claire and I did not speak that last day. There were no emotional goodbyes. There were no attempts to fix anything. Just two people signing the end of a story that, to be honest, had not existed for a long time. Before leaving, she said something. Not angry, not upset, just tired. I never thought it would end like this. I looked at her for a few seconds. Me neither. And it was true. But something else was also true. That many things had led to that point. Not just the money, not just the prenup, but everything that came before. The differences, the ways of seeing life, the small decisions that accumulated end up breaking something bigger. When I walked out of that building, I felt something I had not felt in a long time. It was not victory, it was not satisfaction, it was clarity, because for years I thought the problem had been the money. Then I thought it had been the prenup, but no. The problem was much simpler. We were never in the same place. We never built from the same foundation. And when things changed, each reacted according to what they had always been. Claire wanted to protect what was hers. I protected what was mine. Simple as that. Over time, I invested the money from the sale, not impulsively, not to prove anything, just to build something stable, something that was truly mine. Sometimes, when I think about everything that happened, I remember that moment in the attorney's office, the pen in my hand, the document in front of me, and how I signed without reading. At that time, I thought it did not matter, and I was right, but not in the way I imagined, because that paper did not define my marriage. It only revealed what was already there. And the most ironic thing of all is that the agreement she wanted to protect her future ended up being exactly what protected mine. Comment. I wanted to share a few thoughts with you after this story. I truly believe that protecting your peace and self-respect should never feel like a selfish act. In any relationship, being honest about boundaries from the beginning can save both people a lot of unnecessary struggle later on. I've learned that real love always includes respecting each person's individual journey and achievements. Taking responsibility for the decisions we make shows real strength and maturity. Sometimes, choosing to walk away with dignity is the kindest thing we can do for ourselves and the other person. Healing doesn't happen overnight, but it truly begins when we stop forcing what no longer feels right. You deserve relationships where both sides feel secure and genuinely valued. Never be afraid to choose your own well-being, even when it's difficult. I hope this encourages you to reflect on what really matters in your life and to always lead with kindness and inner strength. If you liked it, don't forget to leave a comment and support the channel by subscribing. See you in the upcoming stories.